by Sarah Westwood of the D.C. Examiner, who covers Congress and other things. Sarah, I'm frustrated because we had two hearings this week. We had the House Oversight Committee, the Comer Committee, and then we had the Weaponization Committee, Jordan, and the Republican talk. And the witnesses said very little. Did you go to either of those? Does anyone not tell them that the purpose of a hearing is to get answers, not to give speeches?
I covered the latter hearing, the weaponization hearing that happened yesterday. And yeah, I think what we saw was really a sort of a scene setter, right? We had the Republicans laying out essentially the rationale for the creation of that subcommittee, but it was sort of billed as something, maybe a little more exciting than that. So for anyone who was tuning in, hoping to hear, some bombshell testimony from the two former FBI agents who were there, would have been disappointed, but they sort of alluded to some of the things they have in the pipeline, like future FBI whistleblower interviews that could prove more interesting.
I played a little bit of Nicole Parker, who was the only witness that I cared to hear from, one of the FBI agents, and she talked about the politicization. Then the Richmond FBI office memo on radical Catholics going to Latin Mass surfaced. Did that come up? Did anyone say, hey, what's going on with that?
It's interesting timing that, right, in the midst of that hearing, that the FBI headquarters finally responded to that memo that came out last month from the Richmond field office, saying that there's opportunities to increase surveillance and, criminal investigations of Catholics who go to Latin Mass, and accusing them of having some sort of nexus with white supremacy. So the FBI office did come out and say that memo did not meet the standards of the Bureau, that they were investigating how that even came into being in the first place. They removed it from their servers. I mean, it's still, another black eye for an FBI that has just lost the confidence of the American people in every sense. But,
So if I'm Jim Jordan, I go get Chris Wray and I say, I want you to walk me through from conception to birth to revocation, this memo. Just start. And then I step back. But I asked Kurt Schlichter yesterday, guy who often subs for me, Colonel Kurt, does no one know how to ask questions? Have you ever been to a hearing where you actually thought it was riveting?
No, not really. I mean, I think, there are very few lawmakers who are good at that. It's a real skill. I think there were lawmakers who are no longer there. I think Trey Gowdy was pretty good at that because he had a prosecutor background, but some of the lawmakers, that's not their skill set. That was, I guess, the hope of putting Jim Jordan in charge, because he's good at creating those moments, but there wasn't a lot of opportunities for that yesterday.
You bring up a good name. Now, Trey Gowdy and I had our disagreements on various things, but he was very good at this. Have you interviewed him about his colleagues and their inability to ask questions?
That is a great question. I have not interviewed him since he left office, but, he could maybe teach a thing or two to people. I think some conservatives I know, like my own dad, cringes when he hears Trey Gowdy's name, and they think, he had a chance to get Hillary and didn't with the Benghazi committee. But he was very good at sort of prosecuting a case slowly every time it was his turn to question witnesses. He was very thorough, never got emotional. So those are the sort of types of skill sets. There's maybe a problem for Republicans is that Dan Goldman, the new freshman Democrat from New York, who rose to fame during the impeachment process, asking really pointed questions during the impeachment trials, is sitting on that panel and was, in the spirit of objectivity, one of the best questioners.
Yes, he's a prosecutor. The worst thing that happened to Republicans this week is that Nancy Mace went viral, and that which gets rewarded gets repeated. So she gave a little speech about the vax and her terrible health problems, and it went viral, and she raised money, and then other people want that. And I'm just wondering, Sarah, does anyone ever honestly admit that they don't know what they're doing when it comes to holding a hearing?
Oh, never. Of course not. I mean, what purpose would that serve? But yeah, it was not riveting television. It was 4 hours of a lot of really dense and sort of broad, just conceptual discussions about politicization within the Bureau, not a lot of revelations about specific allegations.
Tell me about, are you watching in the room or are you watching on closed circuit at that point?
At that point, I was watching on closed circuit, but,
okay.
It's certain point, there's not a lot of value of physically sitting there listening to them.
There isn't. You know, the best hearings we've had, the most dramatic hearings we've had have been Supreme Court nomination hearings because we actually don't know what people are going to say. I hope you keep going to these things. It must be a pain in the neck. I'm not your editor, but I sure would go find. There's some other people who've done it well, like Trey Gowdy. I think Pompeo did it well on Benghazi. But who's the best questioner of the two hearings you've watched this week?
Gosh, I got to say Goldman. I mean, he had really good questions that were building towards a broader point, right? You know, he questioned Parker, the former FBI agent, about his tenure and sort of exposed how long ago it was that he was last at the FBI, you know, and it made you sort of question why that
undermine the credibility of the witness. He was great because he knows what he's doing. Sarah C. Westwood on Twitter. I'm not your editor, but I hope you talk to Gowdy or someone on a tutorial for a Republican congressman. Have a great weekend, Sarah Westwood.